What if I told you the fate of an entire continent rests on the shoulders of one man? A young African leader is defying the West, standing up against corruption, exploitation, and centuries of control, and they want him gone, at any cost. This is the story of Ibrahim Traoré, and why his survival could change Africa forever. Why would the most powerful nations on earth, the West, fear one man from a landlocked, struggling country in Africa? Why would they pour millions into propaganda, whisper about covert operations, and plot in silence to remove him from the stage of history? That man is Ibrahim Traoré, the fiery young leader of Burkina Faso. And the truth is, his very existence shakes the foundations of Western control over Africa. Let's be honest. The West does not usually care much about small African nations, unless, of course, there's something valuable to extract. For decades, Burkina Faso was treated as just another forgotten colony, its gold and resources quietly flowing out, while its people remained among the poorest in the world. Few in Paris, London, or Washington even mentioned the country's name. But then came Traoré, a 34-year-old soldier who rose from the ranks, seized power, and with a voice louder than the borders of his nation, began to challenge the entire global order. From the very beginning, Traoré broke the script. He wasn't soft-spoken. He wasn't diplomatic in the Western sense. He didn't sugarcoat his words. Instead, he stood at podiums, stared directly into the cameras, and called out France and America for exploiting Africa while pretending to be its savior. He spoke about corruption, about fake promises of aid, and about a system designed to keep Africans weak and dependent. This alone would have been enough to raise eyebrows in the West. But what made him truly dangerous was his fearlessness. In a continent where many leaders tiptoe around the words they use, Traoré spoke without filters. He called Western policies modern slavery. He accused foreign soldiers of fueling terrorism rather than fighting it. He declared openly that Africa must unite and take back control of its resources. Imagine this from the perspective of Western powers. For decades, Africa's leaders have either been too weak to resist, too corrupt to care, or too isolated to matter. Then suddenly here comes a young man, charismatic, disciplined, and fearless, who commands not just the loyalty of soldiers, but also the admiration of millions of young Africans across the continent. He speaks their language. He reflects their frustrations. He tells them what no Western leader dares to admit. Africa is poor not because it lacks resources, but because those resources are stolen. This is why the West views him not as just another leader, but as a symbol of resistance. And symbols are dangerous. A symbol can't be bought off. A symbol can't be easily silenced. A symbol becomes an idea, and ideas spread like wildfire. So when you hear whispers that Western governments are uncomfortable with Ibrahim Traoré, understand this. It's not just about one man. It's about what he represents. He is a reminder that Africa can stand tall, reject exploitation, and chart its own destiny. And if that idea spreads, it will dismantle centuries of carefully built Western dominance. That is why the question is not just, why does the West want him gone? The real question is, how far will they go to stop him? And this is only the beginning of the story. Ibrahim Traoré's story doesn't begin in luxury, wealth, or privilege. It begins in the dusty villages and army barracks of Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in the world. Unlike many Western-backed African leaders who rise through elite circles, groomed in Paris or Washington, Traoré came from the soil, one of the people, trained as a soldier, hardened by years of watching his country suffer under endless cycles of corruption, terrorism, and foreign interference. When he seized power in September 2022, the world barely paid attention. Western media called it just another coup in Africa, something they've grown used to dismissing. But what happened next made the West realize this wasn't an ordinary change of guard. This was different. Most military rulers in Africa follow a predictable pattern. They overthrow the government, promise stability, then quietly align themselves with France, the US, or the European Union to secure aid and personal wealth. They usually become puppets in exchange for staying in power. But Traoré broke the pattern. He didn't kneel. He didn't beg for legitimacy from Paris or Washington. Instead, he looked straight into the cameras and accused them of creating the very chaos they claimed to fight. In one of his earliest speeches, he asked a piercing question. How can the richest continent in resources be home to the poorest people on Earth? That single question spread like wildfire across Africa. It wasn't just a statement. It was a challenge to France, who has long controlled the CFA franc currency used in many African nations. A challenge to Western corporations that dig up gold, uranium, and oil while leaving behind poverty. A challenge to African leaders who bow down for crumbs of foreign aid while their people starve. To the youth of Africa, Traoré wasn't just another general in uniform. He became a symbol of courage. He was young, relatable, and unapologetic. Unlike older leaders who spent decades making excuses, he spoke with the urgency of a man who knew time was running out for Africa. The West was stunned. At first, they thought they could manage him. They sent envoys, diplomats, and advisors hoping to guide his decisions. But Traoré refused to play the game. He didn't hide his distrust of Western motives. He publicly criticized France's military presence, accusing them of doing little to stop terrorism while quietly protecting their own interests. He called out America's silence on African suffering. He even suggested that the so-called war on terror in the Sahel was a cover for resource exploitation. Then came the boldest move. He ordered French troops to leave Burkina Faso. For France, this was a slap in the face. For decades, French soldiers operated freely in West Africa under the banner of Operation Barkhane. They positioned themselves as saviors, but many locals saw them as occupiers. When Traoré told them to pack up and leave, it was a turning point. No one had dared to do it so decisively since the days of Thomas Sankara in the 1980s. And that's when Western leaders began to worry. They weren't just dealing with another coup leader. They were facing a man who was out of their control. Think about it. The West has always thrived on predictability. They know which African leaders will sign deals, who will bend under pressure, and who will stay silent. Traoré did none of that. Instead, he aligned himself with neighboring countries, like Mali and Niger, both of which had also kicked out French troops. Together they began forming a new bloc of resistance in the Sahel, threatening to end centuries of Western dominance in the region. To the west, Traoré suddenly became more than just a soldier. He was a wild card, and wild cards are dangerous, because if one young soldier could defy them, inspire millions, and form alliances beyond their control, what would stop others from doing the same? This was the rise of a leader the West could not predict, could not bribe, and could not control. And that, more than anything else, is why his name now echoes in Western boardrooms and intelligence offices with a sense of unease. If you ask the West directly, they'll never admit it. They'll never say, yes, we fear Ibrahim Traoré. Instead, they'll hide behind polite phrases. He's destabilizing the region. He's too close to Russia. He lacks democratic legitimacy. But strip away the fancy language, and the truth is simple. The West sees Traoré as a threat to their power, money, and influence. Let's break it down into three powerful reasons. The resource war Burkina Faso may not appear rich on the surface. It struggles with poverty, unemployment, and instability. But beneath its soil lies treasure, gold, uranium, and fertile land. These resources aren't just valuable for Burkina Faso, they're strategic for the world. Gold is obvious. It fuels global finance. Uranium is even more important. It powers nuclear plants and weapons. Whoever controls uranium controls energy and influence. For decades, Western corporations had their hands deep in these resources. Deals were signed in secret. Contracts were written to benefit foreign companies, not Burkina-based citizens. Then Traoré stepped in. He began questioning these contracts. He started strengthening ties with countries outside the Western orbit, Russia, China, Turkey. He spoke openly about resource sovereignty. the idea that Africa's wealth must first serve Africans. For Western corporations, this is a nightmare. Billions of dollars are at stake. Imagine their frustration when a 34-year-old soldier suddenly blocked their access and started rewriting the rules. To them, Traoré isn't just a politician. He's a business problem. And in global politics, business problems are often solved by force. 2. The battle for influence. The second reason the West sees Traoré as a threat is about control. For decades, France treated West Africa like its backyard. Through the CFA franc currency, French banks dictated African economies. Through military bases, they dictated African security. Through diplomacy, they dictated African politics. Traoré shattered this system. He didn't just remove French troops. He embarrassed Paris on the global stage. He declared that Burkina Faso no longer needed a guardian from Europe. He told African nations to unite and stop acting like colonies. The ripple effect was immediate. Mali and Niger followed suit, expelling French forces. Suddenly, a regional alliance began to form, the alliance of Sahel states, built not on Western blessing, but on African self-determination. This is what truly terrifies the West. The idea that Africa could finally act as one. Because if 3, 4, or 5 nations band together, they become harder to exploit. They can negotiate better deals. They can resist external pressure. And they can say no to unfair contracts. For the West, losing influence in Africa means losing geopolitical leverage. It weakens their control over trade, resources, and even global votes at the United Nations. That's why every step Traoré takes toward African unity feels to the West like a direct attack. The fear of a movement, but perhaps the most powerful reason the West sees Traoré as a threat, is something money can't buy: inspiration. 1. Leader standing up might be manageable, but one leader sparking a wildfire of resistance? That's unstoppable. Traoré's words resonate with Africa's youth, the majority of the continent's population. They see in him a reflection of themselves. Young, frustrated with corruption, tired of Western exploitation, and hungry for dignity. When Traoré speaks of sovereignty, they feel it. When he denounces foreign powers, they cheer. When he calls for unity, they believe it's possible. And this is where the West panics. Because if millions of young Africans adopt Traoré's vision, then colonial influence, whether military, economic, or cultural, collapses overnight. Remember, revolutions don't start with armies. They start with ideas. And Traoré is planting those ideas like seeds across the continent. To the West, he is not just a military leader of Burkina Faso. He is the face of a Pan-African movement that could rewrite history. And history tells us something chilling. Every African leader who dared to inspire such change, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Muammar Gaddafi, was met with violence, coups, or assassination. That is why the West sees Traoré as a threat. Not because he commands tanks or guns, but because he commands something far more dangerous: hope. If you expect the West to openly declare, "We want Ibrahim Traoré dead," you'll be waiting forever. That's not how power operates in the 21st century. Instead, wars are fought. In the shadows, covert, silent, and deniable. What we see on the surface is just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it, strategies are crafted, narratives are manipulated, and plots are quietly set in motion. And Traoré, whether he admits it or not, is at the center of such a storm. Economic sabotage. The first weapon the West always deploys is not bullets, it's money. When a leader resists Western influence, they suddenly find themselves cut off from international aid, blocked from loans, and isolated by sanctions. Burkina Faso, under Traoré, has already felt this pressure. Promises of development funding vanish overnight. Western-controlled institutions like the IMF and World Bank suddenly start painting the country as high risk. Investment opportunities dry up. It's economic warfare disguised as financial caution. Why? Because the West knows poverty breeds discontent. If Traoré cannot provide jobs, schools, or food, they hope the people will turn against him. In their playbook, starving a nation is a silent way of killing its leader politically. Media propaganda. The second weapon is propaganda. Watch Western media closely, and you'll see the pattern. Traoré is rarely portrayed as a patriotic leader fighting for sovereignty. Instead, he's labeled with words like dictator, junta leader, or Russian puppet. It doesn't matter that many African presidents stay in power for decades with Western blessing. It doesn't matter that Traoré's speeches inspire millions. What matters is controlling the narrative. If they can convince the world that he's a villain, then any action taken against him, whether sanctions, coups, or worse, suddenly looks justified. And this isn't just on TV screens. Social media is flooded with accounts spreading disinformation, exaggerating his failures, and downplaying his victories. It's a psychological war aimed at both Burkina Faso citizens and the global audience. Intelligence. Operations, but perhaps the most dangerous weapon of all is covert intelligence. History has shown us how Western agencies operate in Africa. They fund rebels, they arm militias, they infiltrate governments, and when necessary, they quietly eliminate obstacles. Burkina Faso is no exception. The rise of extremist groups in the Sahel, groups that somehow always have advanced weapons and endless funding, raises serious questions. Where does that money come from? Who benefits from the chaos? Many Africans believe these groups are indirectly sustained to destabilize nations that dare to resist foreign control. And then there are the whispers, talks of assassination attempts, coup plots, and mysterious infiltrators within Traoré's own ranks. It's not paranoia, it's history repeating itself. Remember Patrice Lumumba in Congo, assassinated with Western complicity? Remember Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's own revolutionary hero? Gunned down in a coup, widely believed to be supported by foreign hands. Traoré knows this history. That's why he rarely moves without heavy security. That's why he surrounds himself with loyal soldiers rather than foreign-trained officers. He understands that survival is not just about politics. It's about staying alive in a battlefield, where enemies wear suits, not uniforms. The shadow of assassination, and yes, assassination always hangs in the air. The West won't admit it, but their track record speaks louder than words. Any African leader who dares to break the chains of dependency finds himself in danger. Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi, all silenced. Traoré is young, sharp, and fearless. But that very fearlessness paints a target on his back. He doesn't just speak against the West, he exposes them, loudly, on international stages. That makes him too visible to ignore, too dangerous to tolerate, and too inspiring to leave untouched. 4. Now Traoré survives because he has what many others didn't, the people. He speaks directly to them. He rallies the youth. He has turned his struggle into a shared struggle, which makes him harder to isolate. In a way, his best protection is not his soldiers, but the millions of Africans who see him as their voice. But, make no mistake, the secret war is ongoing. It's fought through money, lies, weapons, and whispers. And in that shadowy battlefield, every day Traoré survives is a victory, not just for him, but for Africa itself. The story of Ibrahim Traoré is not just the story of one man. It is the story of a continent at a crossroads. A continent that has long struggled under the shadows of external powers and the legacies of colonialism. When we talk about the West's interest in Traoré, it is not merely political posturing or a clash of personalities. It is a deeper battle over who gets to decide Africa's destiny. The stakes are enormous. If the West succeeds in undermining or eliminating Traoré, the message is chillingly clear. No African leader, regardless of their vision, energy, or courage, is allowed to act independently. It would be a reminder that even in the 21st century, Africa's freedom is still conditional, constrained by old powers determined to maintain influence through pressure, interference, and control. Traoré, by contrast, represents something the West cannot easily dominate: He embodies the aspirations of millions of young Africans who have grown tired of corruption, exploitation, and the silent acceptance of external interference. Unlike leaders who carefully navigate diplomatic protocols or appease foreign powers, Traoré speaks with blunt honesty and passion. His words resonate because they are real. They are grounded in the lived experience of ordinary people. He talks openly about the need for unity, dignity, and self-reliance. He calls out corruption wherever he sees it, challenges exploitative systems, and demands justice for those who have been marginalized or ignored for decades. These are not empty slogans. They are a blueprint for a new Africa, one that refuses to be a pawn in global power games. What makes Traoré especially threatening to the West is not his youth or inexperience. It is precisely that combination. He is young, energetic, and fearless. He has not been molded into a predictable, cautious politician. He is unpolished, passionate, and unapologetically independent. For external powers accustomed to negotiating with compliant African leaders, Traoré is a disruptor. He is a reminder that leadership in Africa can be bold, that decisions can be made for the benefit of the continent rather than foreign interests. Every time he speaks, young Africans listen. Social media amplifies his message, and his influence spreads quickly because it speaks to a generation that has inherited both the frustrations and the hopes of Africa's past. The West's desperation to remove him is, in many ways, an acknowledgement of his power. Traoré symbolizes the possibility of a genuinely free Africa, one where decisions are made locally, not dictated by distant capitals. His survival is therefore not only a personal victory, it is a symbol of Africa's potential to redefine itself on its own terms. It is a challenge to centuries of exploitation and control, a statement that African nations can stand tall without seeking permission from others. Ultimately, the question is no longer just whether Traoré can survive politically, physically, or strategically. It is whether Africa itself can break free from the chains of historical and modern exploitation. His continued leadership gives hope that the continent can reclaim agency, assert dignity, and chart a course for a future defined by its own values rather than imposed agendas. Every day Traoré remains in power is a reminder to the world that Africa is no longer willing to remain in the shadows. And that is precisely why the West watches him with unease, hoping in vain for his downfall. For as long as Ibrahim Traoré stands, the dream of an independent, self-reliant, and proud Africa remains alive, and nothing terrifies those clinging to old power more than that. Ibrahim Traoré's fight is far from over, and Africa's future hangs in the balance. If you want to stay updated on this story and uncover the truth behind the headlines, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Join us as we follow the journey of a leader who refuses to be controlled, and what it means for the future of an entire continent.